Welcome to the Gerontological Society of America's Momentum Discussion, where we explore groundbreaking topics in the field of aging.
Welcome to this GSA Momentum Discussions podcast episode titled Benefits of an Early Diagnosis, the first in a series of 3 podcast episodes developed by the Gerontological Society of America, or GSA, in collaboration with the National Council of Dementia Minds, the first national 501c3 organization founded and governed by people living with dementia. We're grateful to Eisai, Genentech, Lilly, and Otsuka for their support of the GSA Care Toolkit for Brain Health in this 3-part podcast series. My name is Jen Pettis, and I'm the Director of Strategic Alliances at GSA, and I'm pleased to serve as a host for today's Momentum discussion. Today's episode takes on a vitally important topic: how receiving a timely diagnosis of dementia can empower individuals to take control of their health, plan for the future, and live with purpose and dignity. I'm joined by 3 remarkable guests who are members of the National Council of Dementia Minds. Stephen A. Barbieri is an advocate living with dementia and president of the National Council of Dementia Minds. Stephen worked for Wells Fargo Bank for 32 years, serving as the vice president and district manager, and is an accomplished martial artist inducted into the Elite Black Belt Hall of Fame. Dr. Joanna Fix is a former college professor with a PhD in psychology. Joanna is a vocal advocate for changing the narrative around Alzheimer's, sharing her experiences to promote the awareness and support for those living with the disease. And Dr. David Compton is a retired family physician and a member of the Doctors with Dementia group at the National Council of Dementia Minds. David is an outspoken advocate for people living with dementia, emphasizing the need to abolish the stigma surrounding cognitive diseases and treat them with the same urgency as other serious illnesses. Stephen, Joanna, and David, welcome, and thank you for joining me today. Joanna, I'd like to begin with you. You were just 48 years old when you were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, at an age when most people wouldn't even consider dementia as a possibility. What led you to seek an evaluation, and how did the diagnosis process unfold?
That's a great question. What led me to seek an evaluation was I was having executive functioning issues and extreme fatigue as early as 5 years before my diagnosis. Actually, even before that, the 5 years or 4.5 before my diagnosis is when I was asked to early retire. So I'm putting that nicely. And a few years before that, I really was experiencing my first symptoms, which were impacting my ability to function, activities of daily living, and were impacting my work. I think the second part of that was, how did the diagnosis process unfold? It was a painstaking and arduous process, as you can imagine. In my 40s, my parents don't have it. It does run in both sides of my family, but I didn't learn that until after my diagnosis and everything came out. We didn't talk about that growing up with our grandparents and aunts and uncles that were experiencing things. But I went through a painstaking, arduous process of let's rule out everything that it could be at my age. They were pretty sure it was MS, and then I didn't have any O-bands in my spinal fluid. And finally, just neurospecialists and brain imaging, finally a PET scan with something called FDG in the IV, I guess, lit up my brain like a Christmas tree. And David knows what I'm talking about because this is his bailiwick. And they said, you have dementia, and it's the Alzheimer's type of dementia. And this is how we know. So I said, wow, that would have been helpful years ago when we were ruling out all the other stuff. And they had actually suspected that and had written that in my radiology reports, which none of the neurologists ever shared with me because they were worried I would not be able to get insurance or employment. And that ship had sailed. So
Thanks for sharing so much. My goodness, what a journey.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that was in your record, but no one shared that with you. That's really incredible.
And interesting and painful.
Troubling, yeah. And so much of your story there goes back to what one of the things David is so passionate about, and that's the stigma, right? That, and even you said you didn't talk about your grandparents having that discussion until after you disclosed your diagnosis.
They were grumpy. We just assumed this is part of old age, and that's like, I'm grumpy too. I was a grumpy teenager. Yeah.
David, as a family physician, you had the clinical background to recognize something wasn't quite right. What prompted you to take the first steps toward diagnosis, and how did obtaining that diagnosis unfold?
What is interesting is you have that clinical background to know it, but when it's happening to you, you can't see it. I know
Understood.
I was having problems with executive function as well, and slowing down in the ability to see patients. Everything was taking much longer. I wasn't sure why. And I was being treated for a rather interesting depression, which seems to be associated with this diagnosis as well. You go through the workups are way too convoluted and marred with the stigma of the narrative in our physicians' workforce, which I've been speaking to for years. And to try to elevate this thought process a little bit better in individual physicians, differentials. Eventually it comes down to me. I had a really good therapist I was working with a depression that recognized it was just more than depression. My wife could pick it up, and a partner I worked with was starting to say, hey, there's a little bit more here. Was sent to Vanderbilt for a fitness to practice evaluation, which I said I couldn't. And they were still confused by that. And they said, some of your day-long neurocognitive testing was a little off, but so you may need to see a neurologist. And you go through this really long story of seeing the wrong neurologist that you don't want to see your colleagues, but this is somebody I knew. And eventually I was able to get in with who I see now, who just focuses on this one area. And I was able to get a diagnosis of myocardial impairment after imaging and workups. But it's very painful, very confusing course on the front end. And everyone I've ever talked to, it's way too confusing. And there's a lot of thoughts here. And I know in the medical community, they're still shrouded in the stigma of the narrative that's not correct. And I'm a big believer that the earlier the diagnosis, the better with anything, whether it be cancer or anything.
Sure. And how long did that process take for you, David?
Not as long as some people. It took about 2 years, year and a half.
Still a long time. Yeah.
But I was fortunate that I was at the right place with the right people at the right time. Even then, it's so agonizing to be told that you can't quite finish the career you want to finish. So but you find a way.
Thank you for sharing that. Stephen, I understand that you were diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, in 2011. Can you describe the initial signs or events that made you realize you needed to seek care, and then about that journey that you went on?
Well, I'm married. I've been married for about 30 years. At the time, this was about 15 years ago when I was diagnosed. The hard thing is that I wasn't seeing the signs, but my wife and I were getting in a lot of arguments. But the arguments all came down to her asking me to do something and me not doing it. That just sounds like a typical husband, though. But what happened was the final straw was I was leaving to go to work, and my wife was a school teacher at the time. And she says, oh, are you going to be in town today? Can you pick up the girls from school? And I must have told her yes. She went to work. I went to work, but then I drove 2 hours out of town to a meeting. So at 3 o'clock, when the girls were supposed to get picked up, my wife's the first name on the contact list. So they called my wife saying, your girls are here. Somebody on their way to pick them up. My husband's probably running late. Let me call and find out where he's at. She calls me. I go, honey, I'm in Fresno, which is 2 hours away. She says, you said you'd pick up the girls today. I said, no, I don't think so. I'm pretty sure I probably told you I was leaving for a meeting out of town. That was like the final straw. She was, I'm having your hearing tested. And I went, oh, okay. So we went in and I had my hearing tested. My hearing was fine. I just had a little problem in my left ear, just a little bit. But when you go to a hearing test, not all the machines are in one room. So in one room, I did a few of the tests, and then they took me into another room down the hall, a bunch of turns, and did some more testing. And then when I was done there, they asked me to just go back to the room. Well, they ended up finding me in the hallway because I could not remember how to get back to the room because it was my first time in there. And then also they noticed when they were asking me for the hearing test, I kept having to ask them to repeat things. I'm sorry, what am I supposed to do? And I'm sorry, what were those instructions again? And I kept having to repeat things. So from there, they contacted my primary care physician and says, his hearing's off just a little bit, but I don't think that's the primary thing. I think I might recommend some cognitive testing. And that's how it first started, was with cognitive testing. Like David and Joanne have also said, that it's a grueling process, because it's very rare that they hit the nail on the head on the very first try when it comes to what type of dementia. So the difficulty was, they started when I saw a neurologist, which is the person that you really want to go see, is not your primary care physician. You really want to get a referral to see a neurologist. So when I saw a neurologist, they did some primary testings and things, and they first came with MCI, mild cognitive impairment. They said, oh, it could be a lot of stress from your job and everything. I'm like, okay. And then I said, was there some additional testing we can do? And then she says, I came back a few months later. She did some additional testing. She says, you know what? I think you actually might just have pseudo dementia. And I went, pseudo? I am not familiar with pseudo dementia. She said, pseudo dementia is caused based on stress and low in certain vitamins like vitamin D and some magnesium, some other things. So they thought, oh, if it's pseudo dementia, this could be corrected. We get you away from the stressful situation. I go, that's strange, because I work out on a regular basis. I take vitamins. I do all these things. So I said, is there some additional testing, like scanning, we can do? So again, you have to be your own best advocate. So the next thing they did is some additional testings, which led them to think it was frontal temporal lobe dementia, because they did a PET scan. And in the PET scan, they found damage on both sides of my temporal lobe, which they just assumed was frontal temporal lobe dementia. So they started treating me like that. And then it just didn't sound right. So they did some additional testing, and they thought maybe it was Alzheimer's. No. And then the problem is that they never sat down and asked me lifestyle. Oh, so Stephen, what do you do for fun? What have you done in the past? Tell me a little bit about yourself. Finally, they sent me to an 8-hour neuropsychologist. And the person says, Stephen, I want to get to know you. He put his folder down and says, tell me about yourself. What do you do for fun? A little bit about this. Tell me your background. What did you do growing up? The conversation gradually finally got to martial arts. I've done martial arts probably all my life since I was 16 years old. I got hit in the head, lots of fights, concussions, and then, concussions, what other things? Oh, I got hit by a car, hit my head on a diving board. All these things started making more sense. And then within 20 minutes, he goes, oh, no, your classic case of CTE dementia. And I said, well, I've never heard about that. So from there on, they took the time to explain what was going on and whatnot. But had I not gone for that 8-hour testing, they still wouldn't have figured out what it was. So that's what they finally landed on, is the CTE dementia. And actually, there's a movie that came out with Will Smith called Concussion. I think it was in 2012, with the football players. Oh, I thought, oh, this is a great movie. I'm not familiar with CTE. I'm going to take my wife and my 3 young children. At the time, they're in their teens, to this movie. Really, not to blow the story, but all the football players in the movies killed themselves through suicide, because one of the major side effects of CTE dementia is suicidal tendencies. So that I have to be very careful about, any type of medication I take with suicidal tendencies or whatnot. But no, it was one step and more steps. And the biggest thing is, you just have to keep pushing the neurologist. When they use the word dementia, you have to ask them what type. It's important to ask those additional questions and be your own best advocate.
And Stephen, how long did that process take you till you got that diagnosis?
I think it was just close to a year. And the reason mine seemed a little bit quicker is because I kept pushing and asking those questions. When they use the word dementia, I said, that's like telling somebody they have cancer. The next thing is you would tell them what type of cancer. So you're telling me I have dementia. What type of dementia do I have?
Sure.
Oh, and that's what made him start doing all these additional testings. Had I not prompt them or asked those questions, I'm not sure if I would have gotten those additional testings at that time.
Sure. Sure. So thanks to you all for sharing a bit about your story, but let's now switch gears and talk about why this is so important that this happens earlier for people. So Joanna, let's start with you. How can receiving that earlier diagnosis have a positive impact on relationships with family and friends?
Well, I can only dream of what it would have been like to not go through 4.5, 5 years of feeling like I was being perceived as a malingerer. And I think that after my diagnosis, I printed off paperwork. I made copies of the radiology report and the doctor's notes and just sent it to my family because it really did impact my parents and my brothers very negatively, not having a diagnosis, not knowing why I was having these issues. And it was stressful for everybody. And when you know what you're dealing with, then you can move forward. When you don't know what you're dealing with, you're stuck. It's like being stuck in a red light. And it never turns green. You're just sitting there for what feels like eternity. And so when my neurologist sat down and the day I got the diagnosis and it was unequivocal, this is clinical, here's your proof, you don't need a bunch of more second opinions. It was my ninth neurologist. He gave me the answer that me and my family had been seeking. He gave me a definitive diagnosis. He gave me what I needed to move forward. I feel really blessed that I have this both local and global community to be able to talk with and have that support. And we're all educators here. We continue to advocate. And like Stephen said, we have to be our own best advocate. We have to bolster each other. And there's nothing quite like meeting other people with dementia. I say all of my friends, all of the people that I love the most, other than my husband, either have dementia or they work in the field or they are caring for a family member. It's a real special thing to realize that, you know what? I went from being isolated and feeling like I was on a completely different planet during those years preceding getting my diagnosis because you don't have work anymore and you're acting crazy, and at least I was, to all of a sudden I've got more friends than I've ever had in my life. I've got a fantastic support system. I have a really good life. And if Alzheimer's was the price I had to pay to have this really good life, I'm not really that too upset about it.
Okay. And so, David, how about thinking about navigating changes in work life and social activities? What are some ways an early diagnosis can help with that?
An earlier proper diagnosis of anything is important. I just want to say that first. This is true of their diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or this. Now, everything changes. Your work changes or how you work, or if you can work. Routines need to change. Relationships have to be reevaluated. The financial impacts are there. The long-term healthcare has to be looked at. And then lifestyle, you have to change your lifestyle and work with your medication. Anything to do to improve cognition. If you have sleep apnea, you have hypertension, be sure it's adequately treated. Be sure the lipids are treated. Develop some activity routine. These are things that have to be done to navigate this. It's a nursing course that you have to go through to get there. I was fortunate that I had some good support people around me. I was able to get into a support group earlier, and we actually set a support group up of just people living with it in the greater Knoxville area back in 2018. It continues to meet. There's 2 or 3 areas, and this is critical, finding other people with it and talking to them about their life experiences and how they navigate this illness. This illness, cognitive issues can manifest themselves a whole bunch of different ways. And so it's sometimes the same story is not going to be the same for somebody else. But so it's good to communicate with other people this diagnosis.
Thank you. And Stephen, you were in the banking industry, so I bet you have a really unique perspective on this question of what are financial and legal benefits to getting that diagnosis sooner rather than later.
The benefit is if you're younger, like Joanna had said and myself about being diagnosed at an early age. She was at 48, I believe she said, and I was 51, still working and having that long-term disability. I was actually able to put in a claim where they're actually paying me my check until I'm age 67. So they're now paying me my paycheck for 16 years. And the benefit of that is I tell people I paid with after-tax dollars, so my check is now tax-free. So I always remind people around November time when you have open enrollment at work to sign up for long-term disability. It's different between long-term care. because they don't actually send you the check. They send it to the nursing home. They send it to the doctor. They send it to the physician. Whereas long-term care, long-term disability, they send me the check, and then I'm able to do what I want to do with that money. So I always on social media, always blast everything around November. Hey, open enrollment's coming at your work. Make sure you sign up for your work's long-term disability, because a lot of times there's no medical testing that you have to do or anything. And it covers anything silly. You could be skateboarding and fall off the curb. You could be skiing or whatever and hurt your back or whatever. So I was very blessed I had that. The sad thing is I've talked to other people where they had the long-term disability at their work, but they did not get their diagnosis. So they were going through the process, and like they were asked to leave work because they were making so many mistakes. Or some people, a couple of my friends actually got fired. Some other people actually just quietly just did retirement. And when they finally got their diagnosis several years later, and then they went, oh my God, I have that long-term disability. I could go back and put in a claim. And one of my friends, I have a sad story. He missed his deadline by 2 weeks to put in a filing for his long-term disability because he'd already been away from his work because he had left his work. They basically told him to leave because he was making too many mistakes. So it's important to get that early diagnosis, because a lot of things, if you have long-term disability, short-term disability, or if you're still working, you qualify for permanent disability through your state at the same time. So again, it's important to do that push. But like I said, a lot of us, it takes sometimes years. So again, we always have to push for that. Okay, we've done this test. You don't have your answers. What's the next test?
Okay, great insights. Thank you. Joanna, do you know of any resources that become more accessible when a person is diagnosed early?
I have the Home Community-Based Services Elderly Blind and Disabled Waiver. And what that means is my spouse gets paid 40 hours a week to be my full-time care partner, which I prefer to use that term than caregiver. What precluded that was me getting a Social Security disability. Now, you can imagine almost at the 5-year mark, you have a certain amount of credits you've paid into the system when you're employed, right? And when you're sitting there waiting for answers or trying to function and trying to manage your life, that time eventually runs out. And I was 6 months away from running out of being eligible after being turned down actually 3 times for Social Security disability, not having that diagnosis right until that last 6 months, and got in front of a judge and then got in front of another judge. You've got to be your own best advocate, and you've got to move that needle because this is your life. No one's as interested in your life as you are. And then I was qualified again through my state, which is Medicaid, for long-term care. And every state in our country has a home and community-based services, elderly, blind, or disabled waiver that's through the Department of Human Services. Sometimes there's a single entry point. There are financial resources as well as other resources out there. You don't have to just live in a hole and lose everything you own. So that's been wonderful since I was lighting 4 fires a year with my husband at work. And I said, yeah, I don't think I can do this anymore. I really need some supervision. I need somebody here with me to help me function in the house safely. We know National Council of Dementia Minds is a huge resource for those of us living with dementia and for care partners and family members caring for someone and professionals. I think there is no resource like other people living with dementia.
That's great advice. Thank you. So, David, I'll turn now with my last question for you, and then Stephen will actually have the last word. What one thing do you wish every primary care provider would do when it comes to recognizing and responding to early signs of dementia?
Listen and respond appropriately to symptoms that patients are giving you, and don't blow it off as to something else. I'll paraphrase Sir William Osler. And if you listen to the patient long enough, they will tell you what's wrong with them. And that is true. The symptoms are sometimes right in front of you. We need our physician workforce, whether it be primary care, neurologist, anybody in the field, because I've had neurologists be a little slow to make this diagnosis. It depends on the neurologist. But to pay attention to these symptoms and try to follow up on them, even if they're mild, try to focus on that, elevate these diagnoses in the differential. when somebody comes in with these set of symptoms. It's simple. Listen.
Okay. And Stephen, my last question is for you. What advice would you give someone who's seeking that early diagnosis?
Well, I think we've heard that phrase many times today. You have to be your own best advocate. You have to keep pushing for that. When you go in there, you need to not let them blow things off, kind of like what David was saying. When you say, "Oh, this is happening on the dark. Oh, that happens to me all the time. Oh, that happens to me." The thing you want to do is just get past your primary care physician and get to a neurologist. That's the person that's really going to do the diagnosis and get the ball rolling. And that's the one that can really order the testing done at the same time. And it's important too, not to just fall on the diagnosis of dementia. I hear people say they get on group calls with us. Yeah, I was diagnosed with dementia. I'm pausing, waiting for the next thing for them to say. And then they stop. And then I interrupt them. I said, "Did they tell you what type?" "Oh yeah, they said I have dementia." I said, "No, that's kind of like somebody saying you have cancer. And then the next thing, it's important to know the type of cancer you have. Is it lung cancer, tongue cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer? Because there's different symptoms and there's different protocols in place for that. Same thing with getting a diagnosis. It's very important to get a diagnosis. The nice thing about, we have people come on our calls on the National Council of Dementia Minds that haven't gotten a diagnosis yet. They talk to some of the people on the calls and we point them in the right direction. Make sure you get past your primary care physician. Go see your neurologist. The other thing is that I tell people, don't go see the doctor first thing in the morning. Why? That's the best time of the day for us. We just woke up. We had 8 hours of sleep. We might have had our coffee, a little bit of caffeine or whatever. We're ready for the day. We're at our best point of the day. You don't want to go when you're at the best point of the day. I remind people, you want to try and get the last appointment of the day in the office. The reason for that is that's your worst time. You don't want to go see the doctor when you're at your prime peak of the day. You want them to see what a real day looks like. And a real day for most of us is, as the day goes on, our symptoms become more and more noticeable. So I always tell people, when you're going in for testing, don't go first thing in the morning. When you're ready to go, try and get the latest appointment. I'll be tired at that time. Exactly. That's when I stutter and I have word finding problems more. Exactly. That's what you want them to be able to see. They need to see what you really look like. So it's important, the timing of the day when you go see your doctor too, which doesn't sound right, but in reality it is. You want them to see you at your worst.
Great advice. And Joanna, I think you had something to add.
And so my specialty was cognitive testing. This is what I did as a psychologist and what I taught as a college professor, psychological assessment. And I worked with law enforcement and I worked with behavior and intelligence testing. So when I started on my diagnostic journey of, I wonder what's wrong with me, I went through 2 of those neuropsychs. I came back for my follow-up and she said, "You seem fine. Everything on the test says you're not having your average or above average." I said, "No, I'm not asking you if there's a problem. I'm telling you there's one. This is my wheelhouse, okay? And I'm telling you my baseline, because we had to do all these tests on each other in graduate school, it started way up here and now it's way down here." And she was just mind blown because she couldn't figure out what this meant. I'm here telling you there's a problem and you're being paid to figure out with me what that problem is. If you're not up for the task, I'll move on to the next specialist. But I am not going to sit here and argue with you whether I'm having a problem. That's not happening. So when you're not getting the information or the support you need, never be afraid to stand up and walk out and seek another opinion. I got 9. And when I got to 9, I got my answers. And even though that's not what anybody wishes, it is what you have to do, okay? You know yourself better than anybody else. Be your best advocate.
All right. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. You guys have been terrific guests, and thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your insights. And most of all, thank you for the advocacy that you all do for everyone who's living with dementia. Thanks to those who are listening to this episode of the podcast. Remember, it's the first in a series of 3 with our friends at the National Council of Dementia Minds, and we hope you'll listen to all 3. Thanks again so much for joining me, Joanna, David, and Stephen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity today to share and have a voice.
Thank you.
Check out GSA Enrich at geron.org/enrich for engaging learning resources, including toolkits, publications, webinars, podcasts, and more.